Good morning, friends. I'm very happy to see you all here and very warm welcome to the Crop and Biotech Seminar Series. Today we are having that seminar number 6 and we got very eminent speaker with us today. But before that, let me acknowledge that Murdoch University is situated on the lands of Warjuk and Winjareb Nungar people. We pay our respects to enduring and dynamic culture and the leadership of Nungar elders, past and present. And the country on which Murdoch University is located has the thousands of years been a place of learning. We at Murdoch University are proud to continue this long tradition. Now, before we start our seminar, would like to welcome once again Professor Ndiko Ludidi. And Professor Ndiko Ludidi is the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and Natural Sciences at the University of Mpumalanga. He is an extraordinary professor in the Department of Biotechnology at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. He served earlier as a professor of biotechnology at the University of Western Cape in South Africa before joining at UMP. And he is a National Research Foundation rated researcher with expertise in plant molecular biology, plant physiology, and biochemistry. He has extensive university-level teaching experience in biochemistry, plant biotechnology, and plant physiology. Among his various academic leadership roles are internationalization efforts focused on research, innovation, and engaged scholarship to develop climate-smart regenerative agriculture systems to produce climate change-resilient crops and develop crop production systems that promote environmental sustainability in agriculture and ensure food security. Among many other roles, he is a senior editor board member for several journals like Scientific Reports, associate editor for BMC Plant Biology, review editor for Frontiers in Plant Science, and a member of the management committee of the DSI NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security and member of advisory committee, which include the GMO Act of the Directorate Genetic Resources of the Department of Agriculture. He is also the deputy chairperson of the Council of Elsenburg Agricultural Training Institute, and he held a 6 months Fulbright Visiting Research Scholar Fellowship at the University of Missouri, Columbia, a famous place for soybean research, and you will learn about the soybean from Ndiko in his presentation. And he is also a member of the steering committee of the International Consortium for Research and Applications of Legumes, for which I am one of the co-chair. And I am really pleased to share that Ndiko and I have been collaborating for last several years. And it's really a pleasure to have you, Ndiko, here in Perth. So please join me in welcoming Ndiko. Ndiko, floor is yours, please.
Challenging to speak while sitting. I come from a tradition where you do not speak to people while sitting, you stand to show respect. So if you find that
because of this thing, even I could not stand up here.
But if you find that I stand up, so don't be surprised. You know, I might change it between the two activities, sitting down or standing up. Thank you very much, Rajiv, for the very warm welcome, and I must acknowledge the university for hosting me today. So thank you very much. So my task today is just to give you a short thought, if I can put it that way, on food security in general, but really zooming in on the potential of what we call underutilized crops. But I would like to follow suit with new developments that change the name from underutilized to opportunity crops. Because when you say underutilized or neglected, it's got this negative notion of the crops. Whereas if one looks at what one can do with these crops, then underutilized is true, but there's a lot of potential that lies in the crops. So if I say opportunity crops, just know I'm referring to underutilized crops. neglected crops. So my university of affiliation, of course, is the University of Mpumalanga, and that is in the northeastern part of South Africa. And I thought that it might be important just to let you know that it's a very young university, only 10 years old. The reason for establishment of the university is that South Africa has 9 provinces. We did not have 9 provinces before 1994. 1994 is the year where we decided that we will not have separate pockets of South Africa, but of one country. And so the consequence of that was realization that of the 9 new provinces, 7 have universities, and some have more than 1 university in 1 city, but 2 provinces didn't have universities. And those provinces were the province of the Northern Cape and also the province of Mpumalanga. So since 1994, then there was a decision to build at least 1 university in each of the provinces. So the University of Mpumalanga is the only university in the province of Mpumalanga. So that's the university where I am based. So just for perspective then, so that we know what we're talking about. I think I would have to change the pointer because that one doesn't reflect. Okay, let me use this one. I think it's gonna be easier. Okay, so I was born in this area here. If you look closer on this map, it's somewhere between the province of KwaZulu-Natal, the Eastern Cape, and a small country called Lesotho. And of course, I migrated from where I was born all the way down to Cape Town, where I did all of my studies. And after that, went further up in Gauteng, Johannesburg, and this is where I'm located. But now I'm not sitting there. I'm sitting right at the edge of it.
But you're not crossing the ocean, right?
I crossed the ocean over a flight. I didn't see the water. So that was just to paint a picture so that you have an idea of where my university is. So it's somewhere around here. To the east is Maputo in Mozambique. Further down is Swaziland. And if you go further up, would be Mozambique. So we are at what is known as the Kruger National Park, very, very close. It's a 20 minutes drive from my university to Kruger National Park. So that was just to get a picture of where the university is located. So I think what I would want to point out is that everywhere in the world there is a challenge of malnutrition. And many times we would see malnutrition as the undernutrition, but even other lifestyle-related diseases are driven by malnutrition and usually being overweight and so on. That's part of malnutrition as well. So it's not only people not getting enough calories and people not getting enough of the micronutrients. I'm not going to delve too much into the stats, but what is important is that any form of malnutrition has a negative impact on human health, and we know this already. In fact, there is almost a half split between those who suffer from a health perspective as a result of being overweight or obese, or as a result of not having enough calories and suffering from micronutrient deficiency. But most of the challenges that we face are related to not having enough food. And that is mostly a challenge for the developing world. So if one looks at this map here, you'll see that, okay, let's just clarify this. If the color is more reddish and dark, then that means a high level of undernourishment. And you'll see that most of this is concentrated in Africa, bits and pieces in Asia, but most of that really around Africa. South Africa not doing badly overall, but what you'll see is also that at household level, then food security and undernourishment becomes a real problem. If you look at South Africa generally, in the general population, you get the impression that things are not as bad, but it depends on where one is looking. If you go to rural areas where there is less development, there's a clear correlation between undernourishment, poverty, and the health status of the people. So this is really a problem. And most of this is not related to the amount of calories that are available, but more in relation to micronutrients, iron deficiency, zinc deficiency, and even the amount of protein that people have access to. And this is what has driven me to think differently about what is it that we do as scientists, not the health scientists, but the agricultural scientists. So those of us who are involved in crop production, what actions are we taking to address some of these challenges? And of course, we can only do that much as far as the science is concerned, and the rest lies in policy formulation. And this is also the reason why I think we as scientists should not be limited to the lab and the desk where we write the papers, but also should really have a sense of activism and advocacy to show that the work that we do can make a difference to the food security status of our people. That can get really worsened by what I used to think as the prediction of what is to come in terms of the impact of climate change on human life generally, but even more so on food security. So I say what I used to think as predicted. But what I've realized is some of these challenges are happening right now. We are feeling the impacts of climate change right at this stage. So it's no longer about what is likely to happen in 2060. Yes, things might not be as bad as they will be in the next few decades, but we are very close to seeing a picture like this. So just to explain, this is a depiction of what it is likely to be when one looks at incidences of extremely wet conditions or extremely dry conditions. And you can see that much of the world is actually going to be drier. If one looks at Southern Africa, which has a picture similar to what happens in, what is to happen in Western Australia. So most of Southern Africa is going to be dry. If you zoom in into the map, you will also see that parts of the eastern part of Southern Africa are also going to be quite wet. And in fact, in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, so this is where cities like Durban are located, and even parts of Mpumalanga, where I showed you, the eastern parts of Wales, we've been experiencing severe flooding from time to time, which has not been seen before. But mostly what is prevalent is high incidence of drought, more so in the western parts of the country, but generally almost every part of Southern Africa experiences severe droughts from time to time. And the frequency of those has become much higher than it was previously. So this is really showing that with time, things are going to get worse, and it's going to be more on the extreme, either extremely wet in terms of flooding, which has an impact on plant growth and crop production, or it would be extremely dry conditions. sadly, those conditions are also accompanied by excessive levels of heat waves. So without going into detail, if one looks at what is likely to happen should global temperatures increase by a certain degree, so 1 degree versus 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees versus 3 degrees Celsius. The clear message is that any of those increases in global temperatures will lead to severe changes in the level of heat waves. So things are going to get much hotter and unfortunately much drier. One of my PhD students was addressing the question of what happens to sorghum when sorghum is exposed to drought in the presence of heat stress. So a combination of drought and heat stress. This was done from a proteomics point of view, linking the observed physiological changes with changes in the proteome. And interestingly, there are some genotypes of sorghum that can withstand this kind of stress, and most of them, though, that we screened, did really, really poorly. And we're trying to understand what it is from a proteome level that determines the responses. And you can imagine a plant that does not get enough water. And one of the classical tricks, of course, is to close the stomata so that the plant doesn't lose water. But if it closes the stomata in the presence of heat, then it cannot cool itself down. So should I cool myself down or should I preserve water? Getting the balance between those is very, very tricky. One of the ways to adapt to that, of course, is not necessarily closing the stomata, but decreasing the stomatal density so that the plant doesn't lose water. I can still open up the few stomata that are there. So that's one of the ways of survival. And one of the things we noticed was that there are proteins that are related to regulation of stomatal movements that are upregulated more in the tolerant genotypes than in the sensitive one. So that's just to say that what we do from a breeding point of view, molecular biology point of view, has to address some of these challenges that crop plants will be facing in the near future. And it's difficult actually for me to say in the near future because it looks like that near future is really, really near. So we have to act fast to address some of these challenges. And so I was talking about plants in general, and I made an example with sorghum, and I did this purposefully because I know sorghum is grown quite extensively in Australia, in Africa where it originates. Some countries still produce quite a lot of sorghum and some don't. South Africa used to be one of the leading producers of sorghum more than 100 years ago. And at this stage, there's very, very minimal production of sorghum in South Africa. And one would think that that's not necessarily a bad thing because we've replaced sorghum with maize. So in Southern Africa, the top producing country for maize is South Africa. And we are self-sufficient in maize production. Very rarely do we import, and this is usually when there's severe drought. Now, this then brings the question, what happens when we cannot produce enough maize? We have to import maize. Are there other crops that we can produce instead of relying on maize? And I'm specifically referring to maize here because, in fact, by acreage, the most produced crop in South Africa is maize, and then after maize is soybean, then sunflower and wheat. Unlike, of course, Australia being one of the leading producers of wheat. So in a case where we cannot produce maize sufficiently, we have to import. And some of us here would know South Africa is a developing country. We have many, many challenges that are related to infrastructure, health, education, and so on. And spending money on imports is probably not a very good idea when you can do something about it. So one would think that maybe we should adopt some of these crops that are more resilient to the impacts of climate change. For example, sorghum would be a good crop. But then the question comes in from a nutritional point of view, do these alternative crops or opportunity crop have sufficient nutrients to make sure that if we should adopt them as mainstream crops, people that rely on them as food are still nutritionally secure. So this brings me to this slide here. And I'm using soybean here as a reference point because soybean is one of the more complete legumes when it comes to protein composition. So if one looks at soybean, roughly around 40% protein, depending on cultivar, of course, and also depending on processing for food. And I'm specifically zooming in into the protein part here simply because one of the challenges in developing countries is access to protein, simply because meat-based protein is expensive. So the average man in the street might not afford meat, so the alternative becomes plant-based protein. And of course, in South Africa, nobody eats soybean. We use soybean for animal feed. We tend to think that nobody eats soybean until you go to those areas in rural parts of South Africa or in townships where people don't have enough financial resources. And they would consume what they call, we know it's soya beans, but our people are actually not even aware that it's not meat, but soya. So they would make the means thinking that they have a meat on their plate, but actually it's based on soybean. And this also brings something to the table in terms of knowledge dissemination so that people know exactly what it is that they are eating. But it's not a bad thing because at least it comes with the required protein amounts. But to get back at my point, soybean has a good source of protein. There are alternative crops. Chickpea is quite popular, and you can see that we've got about 22%. And then mung bean, similar. Now, two of these crops that I have here, Bambara groundnut and cowpea. These are African indigenous crops. And of course, they have good levels of protein, but they are not very popular. If anything, for food consumption, the closest that you will find in most African countries, specifically Southern African countries, would be common bean. It's very hard to find people eating cowpea or Bambara groundnut until you go to those rural areas, and only in certain parts of, for example, in South Africa, you never find somebody in the Eastern Cape or in the Cape Town area consuming any Bambara groundnut or any cowpea. But if you go to Mpumalanga and Limpopo, towards the northern part of the country, then you'll see pockets of Bambara groundnut and cowpea consumption. The challenge that we will face from a climate change point of view is still the fact that soybean is not drought tolerant, it's not heat tolerant. There are genotypes now, or even varieties that we have been involved in terms of screening to identify those that are less sensitive to drought. I don't want to say drought tolerant because then it depends on how one defines drought, what extent of water deficit one is talking about. So just as an example, in our screening of soybean lines, we expose soybean to -1 megapascals is really dry. Of the 87 lines that we looked at, only 2 could do well under those conditions, and this is a real struggle. So do well is just a matter of survival, and there's only 1 that got to the reproductive stage. So this is really just a reflection of how sensitive soybean can be to drought. But under the same conditions, we found that Bambara groundnut was the best performing in terms of drought responses. So it was more tolerant than soybean and even more tolerant than cowpea. But the challenge is whether one could upscale the production and utilization of these crops so that they become mainstream crops. In a case where we are faced with food deficit because of climate change, we might not have any other option than to really look at these so-called underutilized crops and really mainstream them. Strategies for that is something we can talk about later on. But in thinking about the nutritional benefits of these crops, it's very clear. And of course, in a similar manner, if one thinks about resilience to climate change, then these are crops that we should really be exploring. So we did a small review of the nutritional composition of some of the indigenous crops and compared them against mainstream crops. So I was speaking about legumes in the previous slide. So these are cereals. And of course, we know the most popular ones would be maize. And in South Africa, we consume more of the white maize than the yellow maize because the yellow maize is used as animal feed as well. So we're focusing on white maize because that's what people eat. And of course, we know about rice and wheat being so these are the main cereal crops. But if you look at these ones to the left, so that's finger millet, pearl millet, and sorghum, those are indigenous African cereal crops. More popular being in Southern Africa being sorghum, and next in line pearl millet, and then finger millet occupying the periphery. The beautiful thing is that all these 3 are much more drought and heat tolerant than these mainstream crops here. But if you consider the nutritional profiles, just for selected nutrients, I'm not going to talk about protein because that's not the major focus for cereals. It's the major focus for legumes. But from a calorie point of view, all of these are in a similar range. So it's not a question of whether they can provide advantage from a calorie point of view because it's just going to be similar. But I pointed out 2 aspects related to micronutrient deficiency. And if one looks at one of the major micronutrient deficiency globally, and even more so for Southern Africa, which relies on rice and maize, really. Of course, we use wheat as a source of bread mainly, not so much pasta in Southern Africa, really. So you'll see that sorghum is similar to wheat, so you have nothing to lose if you eat sorghum instead of wheat, sorghum-based bread, of course. But if you look at pearl millet, the levels are much higher. And one could almost ask then, why is it that Africa, and Southern Africa specifically, uses so much rice and maize from a nutritional point of view if we have indigenous crops that contain just as much or even more? As far as iron is concerned, the same applies to zinc, similar levels and higher levels in some. But for iron absorption, one requires folic acid. And you can see that the amount of folate in the African indigenous crops is much higher than white maize and rice. So there is a lot of benefit to mainstreaming these crops because they actually offer better nutritional benefit than, for example, rice or maize. So if one takes this and balances it with the fact that these crops can withstand harsher conditions than maize or rice, then there's good reason to say perhaps it is time to focus on these crops, not as alternative crops, but also as mainstream crops. Of course, that isn't just a matter of, well, let's grow this more, because there has to be a market created for it. And if that market can be created, there will be a lot of benefit. And what will determine that is changes in perception, because there's the perception that these crops are associated with poverty, as poor man's food, and all of these connotations around these indigenous crops. And I would rather have them than maize, but I was raised on maize, so changing to anything else requires a bit of rewiring of our minds. So we've done a bit of work in looking at the diversity of pearl millet and sorghum lines that we have access to in South Africa, and did similar kind of work in terms of looking at differences in their responses within the different genotypes when one considers drought and heat stress. We are now thinking of a different approach because the challenge is, as I said, I need to be rewired to think that I don't necessarily have to have a Sunday afternoon where I have pap and vleis. So pap and vleis is a traditional South African barbecue thing. So your barbecue is simply going to be maize and meat, and the meat is mostly going to be beef. Of course, then that means the animals have to be fed with something in order for us to have our pap and vleis. So I don't necessarily have to have pap and vleis being with maize, but it can be sorghum and vleis, or just sorghum and soybean, or it could be sorghum and bambara groundnut, so that I don't have to deal with meat production. So these are some of the things that we have to start thinking about. So in terms of what we can do towards ensuring nutritious food being sustainably produced, perhaps we should look at the biodiversity that we have in terms of these crops. And this is a reason why we've looked at both sorghum and pearl millet as alternative crops for maize, but looking at how the genetic diversity within these two species is associated with the ability of the plants to grow under drought stress and under heat stress, and sometimes combined drought and heat stress. And this answers the question as far as these crops go, but not everybody is going to be open to changing their diets. So some people still continue eating maize, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then the question that we asked is it possible for us to learn from pearl millet and from sorghum in terms of their genetic diversity that we can use as a tool for thinking what it is that we can do with maize in order to increase drought tolerance. So what we've done is compare the proteomic profiles in sensitive and tolerant pearl millet lines versus proteomic profiles in sensitive and tolerant maize lines, with the hope that we would be able to identify genes that can be useful for improvement of maize. Of course, we can't do it via breeding maize with palm it's impossible. But we can think of approaches such as CRISPR and so on to alter the expression of certain genes in maize if we find that some of the genes in maize are common with those in pearl millet, and it's just a question of the levels of expression of those genes and the regulation of expression, which is really the reason I am here to speak to you, because if you go to my lab, I don't even have half of the genomics facilities that you have. And so this opens up space for thinking about collaboration from a genomics point of view, for example, just as an example. So that's really the kind of thinking that we have from a cereals point of view. But this is probably my favorite slide, simply because this is the key of my car, and that's the only reason it is my favorite slide. Anyway, on a serious note, I referred to the most commonly consumed legume in Southern Africa being common bean. And this is just to show the level of diversity that we have in our own collection of common bean. It's not all of them, but just a couple of Phaceolus vulgaris that we have. What we would like to do is not to understand the genetic diversity itself, but to use that genetic diversity as a tool for selection of the most promising common bean lines when it comes to performance under water deficit and under heat stress. So we have a major interest in looking at common bean because it is the most consumed in Southern Africa, and really tapping into the genetic diversity as a driver for selection for drought tolerance mainly, and a bit on the heat stress tolerance. We have some work being done on that. So our interest really is, are there common bean lines that have this characteristic of better performance under drought? And can that be used as a start for breeding drought tolerance in common bean? So that's really one of our interests. But of course, common bean, it's got a limit from a genetic point of view in terms of how far it can go with drought tolerance. So this then drives us to think that perhaps we should look at other alternative crops. I've already mentioned the Bambara groundnut, which is one of the ones we are working on. But what we found is that this crop here, Lablab Peprius, this is what people know as hyacinth bean, or commonly Lablab. I have not seen any human-consumed legume that is as drought and heat tolerant as Lablab. We thought Bambara groundnut does well because we really put it under severe drought stress. We planted Lablab in Mpumalanga in March. So this is when the rains start to go down. And then there's absolutely no rain from April until about mid-October when a few drops start. And we just left the poor thing in the field. No irrigation, no tender care, no fertilizer, nothing. These plants gave really good yield unexpectedly. So we harvested them around June, and we still left them. And this picture was taken about 2 weeks ago. So these are the same plants that were planted in March. they're giving flowers again. I found it really surprising because I thought, they would just die off, but they persisted. Needless to say, these are only two of the land races that we grew in the field. Some of them didn't make it. So in the first harvest, the little that they produced, we kept, and we couldn't have a second harvest because they didn't persist like these ones. So there's something in some of these genotypes that make them stand out and something in the others that make them weak. So we need to understand the genetics that controls this kind of responses. So here again, an opportunity to look at lablab as a legume crop that has a high quality of protein, but can withstand really extreme conditions. So if you look at the field, everything that was planted there is all brown, and the ones that still look green are these ones. So very, very interesting in my opinion. In that field, we had cowpea, we had bambara groundnut, we had soybean. None of those persisted beyond the stage that these ones persisted. So that's really an opportunity crop in my opinion. But the reason this, also the true reason that this is my favorite slide, is this particular plant here. So it's one of the very few plants, legume plants that is, that will produce seeds in the pods, but will also produce a tuber. So this is a very, very young plant, a couple of months old. Tuber is growing nicely. After about 3 years, this tuber will probably be weighing somewhere around 10, 15 kilograms. So it becomes really big. Of course, it's not edible once it's that big because it becomes really fibrous and hard. So that's really not the point. But young tubers, a year, 2 years old, are edible. Actually, I tried reluctantly to have a go at them. Very tasty. The texture is really wonderful, so that's something to bear in mind. But what is important is that the protein content in the tubers is anywhere between 10 and 15%. One of the very few crops, but not crops, but plants, edible plants, with tuber protein content that much high. What drives me really interested is the seeds themselves. Very few legumes would compete with soybean in terms of protein content. The protein content in the tubers here is anywhere between 45 and 40, in the seeds, anywhere between 45 and 48%. And if you look at the amino acid composition, we know that legumes have a challenge in terms of the sulfur-containing amino acids. So this is not the case here. If you look at the quality of the protein, it's similar to soybean. Content, similar and above. So it is a complete food. The challenge, of course, with this one is that, well, I actually doubt if anybody in the room knows about Thalosoma fasciculans or Thalosoma esculentum, because I also didn't know about it until about 5 years ago. And I challenged one of my friends that I work on soybean with and said, if I were to say there is an African crop that can potentially be domesticated and would outcompete soybean in terms of protein content and protein quality, would you believe me? He just laughed at me and said, no, unless you give me a holiday where we can actually go and scout out of the plant and study it. So I took this as a challenge and went off to the Kalahari Desert, where this plant occurs. And voila, we found the plant and analyzed protein content and protein quality. It's really beautiful. So what is of interest to us is to sequence the genome of this particular plant and learn a little bit more about the reproductive biology of the plant, because it is not domesticated as such, but indigenous peoples harvest it in the wild, and they consume the seeds either as roasted or cooked when they are still immature. And so we have interest in this plant simply because we think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of understanding just the biology of the plant and potential nutritional benefits. The fact that it grows in the Kalahari where it's dry and hot without any tender care at all means that should we succeed in getting this plant as one of the mainstream plants, there's an opportunity for resilient food systems just on the basis of that plant as well. All right, so here this is just really to say that we know South Africa relies on maize, so these are small-scale farmers in a village growing maize in their own way, very little fertilizer, not very productive. And when we're going in the field, because one of the things that they struggle with is weeds, so they mechanically remove the weeds. But in the same field, I found that, and that is a legume called Vigna vexillata. Strangely, again, another legume producing seeds that are high in protein, but also producing a tuber, and that is meant to be my finger there just for scale, just to show how big the tubers are. Protein content in these tubers about 20%, so that's really, really quite something. But the relevance to their work is that these grow in the wild and can actually be cultivated in between the maize to suppress the weeds. So that's something that we're trying with them from a cropping system point of view. One of the other aspects of the work that we're doing is looking at the microbiome in the soil as a way to understand what could be in soils that can be of benefit to crop production. So the way we did this was to look at really harsh environments in the northwest of the country, where there's very little rain. We forced sorghum to grow there, had some that is irrigated and some that is not irrigated, grow the plants in there and isolate rhizospheric bacteria from these conditions. So what we're studying is the diversity of the microbiome in the soil and whether under irrigated conditions there are differences versus dry conditions. And the thinking is that the microbiome from dry environments might contain something that can be of benefit to plants. I'm not going to talk about it here. I spoke about it yesterday, where we actually isolated some of the bacteria from these harsh environments and showed that inoculation of seeds with some of the most tolerant ones actually leads to better performance of the plants under drought conditions.
What is it called?
So that's an argument between soft health.
I'm just a camera woman.
She's not just
Mama, probably.
So anyway, I'm gonna the point that they were talking about there is hope. The postdoc was emphasizing that the microbiome is probably one of the key aspects that we have to investigate, and she was insisting that no, she's just a camera woman. After the PhD, she leaves science. I hope she doesn't. So this is the last slide I would like to talk about, where my emphasis is that we have the genetic resources that we can tap into, mostly based on what is found in South Africa and in Africa generally. And we have to exploit that genetic diversity as a tool for promoting resilience in our food system. And the way to do that will rely mostly on genomics, because we have to understand the genetic makeup of these different lines. What you see here is cowpea, and you can see they look different, just in terms of color and seed size. And some of them behave differently under drought versus well-watered conditions. And we have to understand why that is the case if we are to make headways in terms of breeding for resilience to these stresses. And so that is my conclusion. In concluding, though, I really would like to express my gratitude to Rajiv for allowing me to come to Murdoch and talking about my work, and also to thank Yinglong for hosting me in Perth. I gave a similar talk, even though different in content, at the University of Western Australia, and that is really because of his kind cooperation. And of course, that is my group, lab group in South Africa. No blood is ever like that. So that's meant to be finger millet, that's soybean, that's the Marama Tylosema estilatum, no, that's Tylosema fasciclensis that I talked about. The one that I said we had a bet with my friend. So this really is to represent the kind of work that we do, where we look at genetic diversity in different plant species and how that plays a role in adaptation of the plants to the harsh environments. And of course, that is driven by genomics and metabolomics, and I was not able to represent the proteomics, so I left it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ndiko. I think this was very good seminar that what kind of crops we need to focus, especially to address the issue of the food and nutrition security, climate resilience, and you highlighted very nicely about the role of genetic diversity, crop diversification. So this is really very good, and we need to think on those things very seriously. So this is really good. Thank you. We have some time. We can have some questions or some interaction with Ndiko. So please, yeah, floor is open for the questions and the discussions.